When I first started studying for the LSAT, my cold diagnostic was a 152. Eventually, however, I was able to bring my LSAT score up to a 175. So what made the difference in those 23 points? It comes down to simply being familiar with what the question is asking you. If you don't even understand the question in front of you, you're not going to be able to solve it. And so there are questions that are clear at first, like which one of the following must be true. That is just about as straightforward as it gets. But there are other questions that are a little bit more complicated, like assumption questions. But let me scratch that because, of course, there is no such thing as assumption questions on the LSAT, despite what some LSAT prep companies may tell you. Instead, there are necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions, and they are asking you for very different things. Now, if you are brand new to the LSAT, you may have no idea what on earth I am talking about. If that is you, just go ahead, drop a comment. You are not alone. Plenty of people out there are not familiar with the roughly 15 different types of logical reasoning questions, but hopefully by the end of this video, you will be at least clear on the difference between these two types, necessary assumption and sufficient assumption, because they are asking for very different things. Necessary assumption questions are far more common, and so this is the type of question I would focus on every single time. If you don't know how to solve either of these, start with what appears most frequently. And I've been talking a lot about logical reasoning lately because, of course, the LSAT is increasing the proportion of logical reasoning questions on the exam from 1/3 of the test to 2/3 of the test starting in August when they remove the logic games section. So first and foremost, how do you tell the difference between necessary assumption and sufficient assumption questions? It is simply based on the key word or the key phrase in the question stem. Necessary assumption questions will contain words or phrases synonymous with necessity, like depends upon, requires, and assumes. In contrast, sufficient assumption questions will contain words and phrases synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, and properly inferred if assumed. Necessary assumption questions are informal logic, meaning you do not need to create any kind of diagram for these. Diagramming will not help you. These are not formal in nature. You want to interpret the argument in the stimulus, that short paragraph before the question, like you were having a conversation with somebody. Based on that argument in the passage, in the paragraph, which one of the following needs to be assumed in order for the argument to work? Meaning, if that thing were not the case, the argument would fall apart. This is why the so-called negation or denial test works. You go through each of the 5 choices in the answers, you negate them, and the correct choice when negated destroys the argument. Straightforward approach, no fancy mathematical quantitative reasoning here, just informal, everyday life, conversational approach. In contrast, sufficient assumption questions may be formal in nature, meaning in some cases, a diagram might help. An example of this would be the Wiggs question in Prep Test 58. Go ahead, Google that and look it up if you'd like. That's a pretty tough example of this kind of question, but basically if you see several conditional statements in the argument, you may want to consider creating some kind of diagram where you link the evidence pieces together along with your proposed sufficient assumption conditional, and all of this together forms a longer chain that guarantees the conclusion. Of course, in this case, diagramming may help. However, the vast majority of questions in the logical reasoning section as a whole, meaning out of those 25 or 26 questions in the section, diagramming will not be the approach that you want to take. And I would always focus first and foremost on these informal logic questions like necessary assumption. Nail those because they are a lot more frequent. If you want to know what else is common on the LSAT logical reasoning section, I'll share a little bit more with you. Aside from necessary assumption questions, you also want to consider getting really strong on inference questions, including must be true and most strongly supported as well, and flaw questions, questions that ask you to simply identify what is the flaw in the argument. Nail these 3 types and you've got a significant chunk of logical reasoning ironed out. And only then, once you've nailed that, would I ever consider working on sufficient assumption questions, of which there are only going to be 2, maybe 3 in a section, whereas there could be as many as 4 or 5 necessary assumption questions alone. And then, of course, you have inference on top of that. You have flaw on top of that. Of course, at LSAT Unplugged, we'll be devoting increased attention to logical reasoning in the coming weeks and months as the LSAT changes. Check out the links below to find out more. and to book a call with me and my team, we'd be glad to help you out. And in the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.